Hello and welcome to the big story here on the BDTV Breakfast Show. This is where we get to discuss key issues shaping our economy and our nation at large. My name is Elizabeth Musa. Today we're looking at the impact of Nigeria's 10-year privatization on the power sector. 10 years ago, Nigeria embarked on one of its most ambitious economic reforms, the privatization of its power sector, with the hope that private investment and management would end decades of erratic electricity supply. A decade later, the promise of stable, affordable power remains largely unfulfilled for millions of Nigerians, and with persistent blackouts, rising electricity tariffs, and questions around regulatory effectiveness, many are now asking, has the reform failed? This morning on BDTV Big Story, we take a critical look at the journey so far, the challenges, and what the future holds for Nigeria's power sector. Our guest today is Chinenye Ajayi. She is an energy lawyer and policy analyst. Welcome to the show, Chinenye.
Thank you very much.
It's very lovely to see you, and you look very good.
Oh, thank you. You too.
So let me start by asking you, let's take it all the way back. If you look at the 2013 privatization of the power sector, what were the key objectives, and to what extent would you say they have been met?
So, like you said, fast forward backwards. The objective of the privatization was, first was to improve energy access, across the country. It was also aimed at, improving private sector participation because, as if you recall, the government essentially, was in charge of the entire value chain from generation down to distribution. So the idea was to get in private participation to improve efficiency as well. It was also aimed at, reducing the fiscal burden on the government because government had the sole responsibility of managing the entire infrastructure. And the last one I would add is that it was aimed at improving efficiency, improving infrastructure. Now, to the second part of the question, which is whether or not we've been able to achieve that, I would say not exactly, essentially not to the expectation of many Nigerians.
Right.
So, for instance, currently, the energy access rate is about 55 to 60%, meaning over 80 million Nigerians do not have access to electricity. Right. And then in terms of investment, according to a report by PwC, about $100 million is required for investment within this sector within the next 20 years. And just a very tiny little fraction of that has been invested. And then you also see in terms of efficiency, currently the rate of ATC and C losses, meaning aggregate technical and commercial losses, is about 40%, which is far above the 15% standard based on international best practices, right? I mean, we can go on and on, but I would say that, yes, we've made some progress, but definitely not as expected.
So for you, we've made some progress, but certainly not as expected. So Nigerians are still suffering from inadequate electricity supply, and then you'd wonder what's really the main reasons the power sector reform has failed to deliver consistent power supply, because this is a question that many people are asking. We've talked about metering, we've talked about getting on solar, so many introductions, but we're still having this problem of inadequate power supply. I mean, just how many days ago we saw how many million Nigerians are still not having power supply, despite the fact that I can't remember the particular figures, but how many people were already metered Nigerians still not having power supply. And you keep asking these questions over and over again. So what would you say are the reasons why the power sector has, reform has failed to deliver consistently over the years?
I just remember the World Bank report that said, Nigeria is one of the largest, energy deficit countries, and it's really so sad, despite the resources that we have. So one of the challenges has been liquidity, right? Liquidity meaning, the availability of investment within the sector. So because we have very dilapidated infrastructure, which requires huge investment to improve, and there is no investment in this sector, it means its infrastructure isn't improving. For instance, Nigeria's generation capacity before privatization was around 4,000 megawatts. Yes, we've been able to scale installed capacity to about, say, 12 to 13,000, but as we speak, the transmission infrastructure is only able to wheel, say, an average of 4 to 5,000 to the grid. So it means still Nigerians don't have even the benefit of the full installed capacity. So one of the basic problem is poor infrastructure, and that has been a major concern. There's also the aspect of poor tariff structure as well, because cost reflective tariffs are not usually charged. What you find out is that discos are unable to get adequate revenue to be able to invest in the infrastructure. So I can say in summary, essentially, it's poor infrastructure, poor tariff structure as well, and then you also have gas constraints, because it's also one thing you need gas to generate electricity, because about 70% of Nigerian generation capacity is actually thermal, and so that's also a major constraint. And like rightly alluded to, the metering issue as well.
So let me just take my next question from what it is that you have said. You talked about poor infrastructure and poor tariff structure. How do we correct this?
Okay, so let's pick first the infrastructure point, right? For infrastructure to be developed, huge investment is required, particularly for the transmission line, because the transmission line is the weakest link in our sector at the moment. So we need to improve. But thankfully, the Electricity Act contemplates that private sector participants will come into the transmission line. Transmission speed. This wasn't there before under the previous law. So, for instance, the Electricity Act contemplates things like concession, issuance of independent electricity transmission licenses. So what is important is to actually get to implementing these things. So get private investors to invest and then improve infrastructure. But critical to that as well is, do we have the enabling environment that gives investors confidence that when they put in their money, they can get it back? So a key thing to do is to open up that space in terms of transmission, have people come in. And then the second part of it to improve this would be to get to the point of actually implementing cost reflective tariff. I know it's a very sensitive point when it comes to tariffs, but it's something that should be implemented if liquidity is to be restored within the sector, and of course, which then culminate into improved electricity access to consumers.
Right, and then speaking of enabling environment and speaking of the private sector, have the private investors such as the Gencos, the Discos, have they actually lived up to their expectations in terms of capacity, investment, efficiency? Have they maybe to an extent lived up to their expectations?
So from the Genco aspect of things, a couple of them have, for instance, the Azura IPP is doing well. For some others, they haven't been able to do so for a couple of reasons, which I've highlighted. One of them is gas constraints. So some of them already have these plants, but the question is, do they have access to gas? So due to vandalization, and other issues really around the gas space, we find out that gas is not even available, so they haven't lived up to that expectation. And for the discos, the investment expected of them have not also been made. And you wouldn't kind of, okay, let me put it this way, most of the banks that had invested at the point of privatization, right, many of them are not willing to invest anymore, because for you to invest into any project whatsoever, you need to have a clear sight as to how you get your money back, right? So in terms of the required investment, that has not also been done. In terms of efficiency as well, like I said earlier on, there's still a lot of losses, and that is still problematic. So in terms of how much they've done, I wouldn't say they have done so much as expected. Yes.
So do you think that the privatization process, do you think it was flawed from the start?
Well, in a way, because in my view, right, the privatization was more asset transfer focused than reform focused, right? So let me put it this way, because asset transfer was a critical part of the privatization. I agree, but in my view, if more attention had been paid to setting up a proper market structure alongside the asset transfer, right, perhaps that would have improved improved the situation from where we are right now. So I would say it's flawed to some extent. And then another critical issue around the privatization was that at the point where as the transactions were going on, there was a contemplation there will be cost-reflective tariffs.
Right.
That conversation was had then, but as we speak, we know that, we just recently just had Band A being cost-reflective, even though some argue that it's not really,
it's
cost-reflective.
Yes.
Exactly. So that is a major point. And with that, you see that most of the particularly these schools have not lived up to the expectations. So the government has their own fault in the entire scheme of things. We've also had scenarios where government have not kept to their words. Have political interference. Normally tariffs are meant to be reviewed every 5 years, and then government just comes in and say, no, we can't have tariff increase, and that kind of just stalls things. And then we have scenarios where government has promised subsidies, and they've not been able to keep up to that. So in a way, those of these things that I've just highlighted are things that have impacted on what would have been a successful reform.
And how much would you say that government policy, regulation, political interference hinder the progress of the sector post privatization?
Yeah, so like just one of the things I mentioned earlier, which is interference in terms of tariff review. Tariff is meant to be reviewed. There's a long-term time, which is usually 5 years. I think there's another one which is 6 months to reflect inflation, reflect forex fluctuations, reflect gas prices. But we know that inflation has increased over the years, but the tariff is not reflective of that. So that is one way government has interfered. And then the second part again is in terms of subsidy. Now, from EPSRA, for instance, the Act provides for a structured way to administer subsidy, which is what we call the Power Consumer Assistance Fund. But since this is one of the areas of major concern to me, and I'm yet to still get an answer as to why that hasn't been implemented. What we've seen is government pumping in funds, intervention funds at different points within the space, and because it is largely unstructured, and because it's largely not as transparent as we would expect, for most parties just a temporary relief, and then we are back to where we are. So these government policies and interventions have, in one way or the other, have interrupted or pulled us back from where we should be.
And some people will actually argue that the transmission company of Nigeria is still under government control, and some also think that it's a weak link in the value chain. What's your assessment of this?
So transmission, the transmission line has always been a very sensitive point, because I remember, trying to find out why it wasn't, privatized as, or the other aspect of the value chain. And, one of the major concerns is that transmission lines, they go through the entire country, and is a security concern to actually hand this over completely to a private individual. Right. So currently, even though there has been some sort of unbundling to NISO and of course the TSP, what you find out is that government still largely controls it. And for me, I don't think that is really the problem.
Okay.
The government can still own the assets, but have a way of bringing in private sector participants to still carry out certain improvement. For instance, you can do concessions. Concessions meaning I'm giving you this asset, improve it, manage it for so number of years. I am still the owner as government, but you can improve it, make your money make your money from managing the infrastructure, and hand it over to me after a certain number of years. So I don't think the problem is about ownership really. It's about innovative ways to bring in investment and bring in private sector participants.
And what really is the role that the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission, what is the role that it has played, whether it's in form of advancing or hindering the sector reforms?
Now, NEC is one of the most, they've received a lot of bad, backlashes.
They have a bad rep.
Yes, but well, not necessarily bad, bad rep, but I think because they are the regulator, everything just falls on them. Right now, I must commend NEC.
Okay.
The Nigerian power sector is a very challenging one, but they've, if you follow what they've done over the years, we've been, when it comes to regulations, when it comes to guidelines and others, I mean, we have lots and lots of them. They try to be on top of things. But I think where the critical issue is when it comes to implementation. because as much as they are regulators and they want to implement, by the time the government then begins to interfere here and there, there's little or nothing they can do. So NEC has done a lot to to move the sector forward, but then there've been challenges around implementation. There've been challenges around government interference, and there's been challenges around ensuring that the key stakeholders keep up to their end of things. So, like for instance, you have performance standards for discos. Have they been keeping up to it? Are they being penalized? Because once you have a system that penalizes low performance or that has a way of regulating that, you find out that other stakeholders suddenly just get in line and then do what is expected.
And then speaking of implementation and all of that, can we borrow a leaf from any countries that perhaps have adopted or adapted to fix their electricity sector problems?
Yeah, I mean there are a couple of them.
Right.
For instance, we have India. India is very is one of the countries that that's kind of similar to what we have. And interestingly, we've been following the trend here and there. So India currently has a decentralized energy sector as well, where you have the federal and the state, which we've now transitioned into. And then we also have South Africa as well, which is also doing way better than we are doing. And of course, they do also have similar challenges, but they have
load shedding and all of that.
Exactly. But they've been able to navigate that. Currently, the level of generation in South Africa is way more than what we have in Nigeria, despite the population gap. So I would say India is doing well. And it's important that we pay attention to those reforms whilst taking into consideration our own local context, because I'm not a fan of copy and paste, right? It's important that we look at what we have and then tailor our learnings from other jurisdictions to suit what we're doing.
Can we also borrow a leaf from other African countries? You did mention South Africa, but some person might be a little bit unsure about South Africa, especially because they have these issues of load shedding every single time you call your friends in South Africa and they tell you that, oh, there's load shedding. Can we make it 8 p.m. and then we can speak? But Ghana are boasting of constant electricity. So what would you say about countries like Ghana?
Now, yeah, so Ghana is doing well. One of the things you find out about Ghana is, I think I remember speaking to a friend there, if I recall, this, electricity cost is expensive. I mean, they are gearing towards cost-reflective tariffs,
right? Which
is not what we have here, right? Okay. Because I like to tell us, before we even had Band A reviewed, Nigeria was like one of the cheapest countries with the lowest tariff, cheapest tariff across the world. Yes, it was really cheap, because electricity is expensive. It takes a lot of money to get electricity out, and I think what we need to do, particularly in Nigeria, is we need to have that reorientation. Electricity is seen as a public good service. Nobody wants to pay. Everybody just feels like government should give it to everyone free. I think one of the things that needs to be done is to get people to understand, hey, electricity is expensive and it costs money. Of course, there's a need to regulate to ensure that people are not overcharged. But for us to get real improvement, then we need to be able to charge cost-reflective tariffs that attract investors, keep the stakeholders running, right, and then ultimately bring the benefits to the people.
All right, then going forward, would you say Nigeria should consider a total overhaul of the privatization sector, or its reform within the current framework? Do you think it's still viable?
Of course, overhaul is definitely not an option.
All right,
because that would be a bad signal to investors, to the international community. But we've made progress. To be frank, we've made progress. We are not where we used to be, even though we are not where we should be.
No, we're certainly not where we used to be. I remember when I was growing up.
Yes. So it's not we shouldn't have a total overhaul.
Right.
What we should do is to, rather than looking for quick fixes, let's look at the root cause. What systemic or institutional change can we make to bring about lasting impact within the sector? So we have issues as like the liquidity point. We need to deal with the cost reflective tariffs. We need to deal with that. We need to deal with the dilapidated infrastructure. We need to find ways to put in money there in such a way that, we can see this infrastructure improving. Now, thankfully, I heard over I think last week, I learned that, NEC had passed an order where there's, the TCN is now improving in terms of the SCADA, the real-time monitoring of transmission lines to reduce breakdown, right? It's something that I have been, really looking forward to. And now Gencos are now required to connect to that, to that infrastructure, just to ensure that the grid is constantly monitored. It's something that should have been there, like, for God knows how long, but it's been stalling, and I'm glad that we're where we used to be. We're making progress, exactly. Right. So what should be done essentially is we need to look at systemic issues, and in terms of government interventions, rather than pumping in funds, we have, in fact, since privatization, the government has pumped in about trillions of naira into the sector. Rather than just random injection of funds, we need to have structured ways of putting in funds to ensure that it is sustainable. And even when the funds are injected, there should be accountability. How are these funds, utilized, disbursed, so that it's not just a quick fix, we fix here and then we are back to where we are, but something that is more systemic and lasting in the long run.
More systemic and more lasting in the long run. Thank you so much, Chinenye Ajayi, for joining us this morning on the Big Story on the BDTV Breakfast Show. It was truly a delight speaking with you.
Same here.
We hope we can have you again sometime soon.
Definitely. My pleasure.
You've been watching the Big Story on the BDTV Breakfast Show. My name is Elizabeth Musa. Keep watching BDTV.